I'm told the microphones are live, the screens are on, and we're ready to start the afternoon. Thank you all for coming in for an afternoon-long session titled Rendering Speculations, which has been organized with great enthusiasm and energy by Ricardo de Ostos and Tobias Klein here at the AA. I would suggest that maybe speculations of the two words is the operative one in this case, for it is indeed intended as an afternoon to speculate in many different ways on the role, and I would say the accelerating role, that visualization and rendering is playing in our imagination of architectural and many other kinds of futures. Rendering is all, as you know, an act of translation. It's a kind of storytelling. It's the making of a version for something and of a world that has yet to exist, that the very act of visualizing it helps make possible. I think too often, particularly in the narrow field of architectural thinking, rendering is often treated as a kind of secondary or lesser activity somehow done by people to help communicate to others what an architect is already thinking, and that can only be communicated through the making of a realistic picture. The reality we all know as architects is that rendering itself is the way through which we all come to understand what that project might become. A kind of Heisenberg principle, I think, that as we draw and render something, the very thing we think we know changes because of that. And in fact, the 20th century history of modern architecture, I would argue, is largely the history of experimenter after experimenter finding new ways to render or visualize what modern architecture would eventually become. I think from Mies van der Rohe in the 1920s, who appropriated commercial photography to realistically render a modern architecture that up to that point was largely a matter of words or diagrams, to in the 1960s, experimental practices like Superstudio, spending nearly a year on a single image whose purpose was to try and give form or appearance to a project that otherwise didn't exist. I think over and over again, we find that in fact rendering, as we know it, lies at the very core of what architects do, which is to visualize a world that their work in fact tries to make possible in a future that has yet to come. It's no coincidence, interestingly, that in the 1840s, the Architectural Association was founded as an association out of a short-lived group of youngsters that called themselves the Association of Architectural Renderers for a few years before they decided on grander plans of thinking of themselves as architects. In today's hyper-visual world and hyper-visual forms of cultural production, that architecture is just one of many, of course, the role of rendering is changing dramatically and becoming more and more a part of our everyday life, language, and discussion of what we think architecture is. For all of those in the audience that were born after programs like Photoshop, rendering as we know it is now almost the kind of vernacular of the world that we talk about as architecture. And I think that's the context, certainly one of the immediate contexts that Ricardo and Tobias are trying to use this event to try and re-understand. I think the way in which those activities and the acts of storytelling through rendering now connect architecture, gaming, animation, filmmaking in new and increasingly proximate ways is, of course, one of the obvious features for why this session has been put together the way it was, deliberately as a cross-disciplinary discussion of the topic. And I know it's one that's going to lead to a great and interesting discussion and debate about where we are today on that activity. And I'm going to turn over to Ricardo and Tobias, who will introduce today's participants in the session that you're going to have. Thank you all very much for coming.
Well, we just have to thank Brett for the very, very generous introduction. He has been paramount on processing this event, which started as some sort of brainstorm between me and Tobias on how we could create an event based not only on our personal interest, but some of the main influence, not only from architecture, but from our life in general, from playing PS3 to looking at Andrew Jones on the screen or watching the films that we all watch at Odeon down the road. So just to start the conversation, maybe from the beginning, if it's not too boring, I'll read a few words to explain where we're coming from. I'm Ricardo, as you probably know, and I'm from a studio down the road called NaJa-DeOstos. And the idea today is the symposium was born from a simple idea of bringing together agent provocateurs from various visual disciplines to discuss how creative and speculations works hand in hand with a process, something that we talk a lot about here at the school. This implies an interest for new ways for expression and manifestation of ideas. This close link between making stuff and how you make might imply a labor on tools, on orchestrating techniques. However, today's symposium is really not about techniques as a foreground. In fact, we arrogantly would like to state the opposite. Today's interest lies in content and creativity nurtured by personalized ways of expression. So here, maybe the ambiguous use of having a symposium called rendering speculation, while the first word is dismissed as a pause effect on 3D softwares and sometimes between us rudely direct. The second might be sometimes seen as a luxury for academics living in an ivory tower, in this case, speculation. But enough of preconceptions, because we're here to talk of what must be said and done, to talk about what makes us tick. Inspiration, expression are allied to intuition, like an unstoppable force when meets a movable object. Like in Fellini's film 8½, he said something that might be quite relevant for the spirit of this afternoon. When Guido, the director, said, "I thought my ideas were so clear. I wanted to make an honest film. No lies whatsoever. I thought I had something so simple to say, something useful for everybody. A film that could help bury forever all those dead things we carry within ourselves. Instead, I'm the one without the courage to bury anything at all. When did I go wrong? I really have nothing to say, but I wanted to say all the same." So that's it. Simple and complicated. Unavoidable, fatalistic, and hopeful. In other words, humane. So let's put our heads up and dream on a horizon with new things ahead. Strange creatures, strange renderizations, and strange build environments. This afternoon we're going to be navigating through CG film sets, digital live painting performance, narrative scenarios, experimental drawings, and political projects. The concept of speculation will be discussed as an inventive design methodology. In an age where borders between physical and virtual environments are constantly shifting, the symposium looks to stimulate a debate on how architecture can explore emerging medias and assist in the creation of new visions that we can imagine, aspire, and experience in the years to come.
Good afternoon. That's just going to be relatively quick because, well, everything has been said towards why we're doing this. But the speakers that we have invited, I think it would be quite nice to introduce them a little bit, why we have invited and what have they done. The first speaker, M.Colletti, a former teacher as well of mine and a great educator, recently published and edited the AD Exuberance, and that is a consequence of, with articles such as the Pornamental, and it's a consequence of his briefs from Unit 20 in the Bartlett, something like Sacred, Secret, the Sublime. And in his work as well, the works are how he tackled the visual with his PhD on the 2.5 dimensional and 3.5 dimensional. Might be very interesting to look at, and I'm quite excited to see him. We have I'm not going to do it kind of chronologically how we are going to see the speakers. So I thought it would be quite interesting to see with Marian contrasting and comparing another great educator, Lebbeus Woods. His works that we're going to see in the afternoon have inspired us all, and it's just a great pleasure to have him there. His works on, let's say, for instance, the violent Sarajevo project in comparison to the very lightness of his Flying Cities over Paris, and his manifesto of architecture is war, in the context of what we heard about rendering speculations. I think they're going to be quite thrilling, and they're going to be comparison about how a visual, how a rendering, how a critical speculation can happen through the visuals. Andrew Jones, I was very tempted to just read out your biography, which I think sums it all up, but the word creative evangelist sticks out and is a broad statement and something to aspire to. Seeing some of your performances, how fluid you use mediums to create a moment that is inspiring, that wants you to pick up a pen, wants you to draw, wants you to visualize something to communicate further, something to inspire, to create creativity. And I had a conversation with Ricardo about you when you meet last night, and 1993 when you started with Photoshop. I think that was maybe a very inspiring moment for you, but for all of us, and the consequence actually creates a potential, and it's fantastic. Z.Fogel, she is, again, it's an impressive CV of somebody having worked on some of the most inspirational animation films, such as Ratatouille, Wall-E recently, the Cars, Angels and Demons. So we're going to see cinematographic architecture put on the big screen, and the animation, the visuals behind it, the ideas, but as well the techniques, but how they have transformed something of a story into a visual. Something today is happening in architecture, and it's why we are doing this event. Last but not least, and I think that's quite important that it's absolutely not least, we have the great pleasure to have Zara Hadid with us, and I've been told she has put people on the task to get actually her old archived drawings out. Some of the drawings we've recently seen in the First Works exhibition there upstairs in the members' room. It was impressive being there and seeing those gigantic drawings opposite, like the micro-megas of Daniel Liebeskind. Some of these ideas of somebody using representation, but actually consequently building representation and mixing the representation into the design and the design into the representation. I think that's one of the foremost architects who made this cinematic, visual tectonic architecture, a rendered speculation into an actual speculation, and therefore kind of started to amalgamate that virtual and actual. Finally, just very quickly, we like to have a big thanks to Brad Steele, the director of the school, for all his support, his ideas, his structuring while we actually started planning this event, and his criticalness in that, in its conversations that we had. We'd like to thank Crystal for their support, for their sponsorship, and in particular, thank you to Ximo and Lucy for all your support, but as well for suggesting how and suggesting people that we could invite, giving critical feedback on how their point of view could be responsible. And finally, I guess, no, not actually finally, the speakers that made time today. That's fantastic, and it's going to be a great event, and thank you very much. And last, again but not least, the AA staff, who without their help, we could actually not make that happen, and who kind of rendered an idea for us, with us together, to make this happen today. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce M.Colletti. Thank you very, very much.
Okay. Let's see if I can manage this. Okay, well, thank you very much, Ricardo, Tobias, and AA, everybody, for the invite. I'm very excited to speak here. It's the first time. Some of you may know I come from down the road. So I'm faculty at the Bartlett School of Architecture in Westminster, but I come in peace. So please, no hostility here. I mean, I think it's a great platform, and also I think it's great to talk about a different understanding of architecture that perhaps more than give utter statements may raise more questions and increase the debate, and through that also the conversation and the vocabulary of architecture. I'm a teacher, as I mentioned. I'm also a practicing architect and a researcher. I'm not going to dwell too much on the research. At the beginning, I thought that maybe I might discuss speculation in theories, because that's somehow also a medium to render ideas and to ask questions about architecture without necessarily the involvement of media and technology. But then, just because I'm a compulsive, obsessed drawer myself, I just thought I can't resist, and I'm going to show actually more drawings than theories. So I'm also not going to mention too much the work, the program, the function that lies behind the project, but I'm going to just chat about what, as the two guys said, what ticks in me and what drives me to create images as a way to establish a feedback device for me to interact with my own production and find ways to translate and communicate those visions to a third party. So the speech is going to take about 25 minutes, and it's about design, project, and script, and about rigor and yet approximation. And I suppose because we're not going to talk today about fabrication, about the necessity of bringing this virtuality into the actual world through manufactured pieces, I just thought that it's a good way to talk about this unexact in-between state of imagery. As I said, I've got criticism, but whole respect for what is being done in academia. I think that it's very important to take silly questions quite rigorously and critically as relevant for the understanding of the avant-garde. I'm not going to bore you too much with references. From my PhD, which is basically a whole series of questions about this feedback, or about how can an architect, a designer, become intimate and creative through its own process and the computer and the digital medium to create this feedback loop within himself to establish, again, intimacy and yet approximation of a vision that it's in me, and what are the tools and the possibilities to translate that into a medium that other people can understand. So just think these two images are actually quite funny but yet critical. On the right, an image of the Royal College of Art, one of Professor Tony Dunn's students. On the left, an attacker, as you can see. That's very much to do with intimacy and this obsession that we have with the relationship with digitality, virtuality, the cyber, and the computer. As you see, the guy on the left just brings the computer into his bed to be constantly online. That's before Twitter and all these kind of things. But it's, it really talks to me about this obsession that is generated through the capabilities of the computer, of having this feedback device. On the right, the image where this intimacy is really, really on a high grade, but yet it's quite critical in a sense. If that's the only thing that architects are worried about, I think the danger lies in disregarding history, identity, culture, place, and another context that is relevant to the multi-layered understanding of an architect's production. So it's feedback, most of all, that I think is the main attribute of rendered speculation. And in fact, here, a quote by Walter Benjamin, as you can see, buildings are, yes, evaluated or appropriated by use, but also by perception. And it's the fact that actually architecture is also part of the visual cognitive environment that makes the presence and the relevance of rendering, of image making, of communication, of visualization of those visions or the ideas that one has about architecture crucial. About this feedback, it's not necessarily to do with mediatic responsiveness or interaction, those kind of things, but to me it's very much to do with perception and cognition. So this is one of the first images that I did. It's a truly unique digital image in a sense that it works at its best in the computer. It cannot be done by hand. And it works somehow on the data projector. It works better on a computer screen because it's digital by essence. And the more you look at it, hopefully your eyes or the image start blurring and moving. Actually, it's not animated. It's just your eyes that start to fix and to focus on this blurry aspect that makes the distance between you and the eye, basically, and engages the viewer in a feedback loop, a cognitive feedback loop between you and the image. So other images that are digital, they're not parametric per se, but they're computational and have properties that we can understand. To to me, some of these render speculation that's more than just an illustration of techniques. It's actually almost like a non really precisely, how to say, an image that it's very difficult to explain what it is that I want to achieve with it, but it's somehow there always for me as a goal of experience, of a quality that I would like to achieve with my architecture. Nevertheless, as an architect, I'm not an artist, I'm an architect, and I would not like to be mistaken by one. I think it's crucial that as a strategist, I'm capable of creating the system, of creating the techniques to be capable of reproducing this. So reproducibility of an image, to me, or of digitality, is quite an important aspect in the sense that if it's not capable of being translated from one medium into the other, it's very difficult for it to be evaluated by other people, clients, students, engineers, and so on and so forth, to be part of a wider protocol of architectural generation. So let's talk about architectural design. It's obviously, I would like to talk today about design, this idea that actually to draw is something to do with an abstract value of virtuality. So it's not necessarily, the drawing doesn't necessarily need to be an illustration of a building, but it can be per se a product, an architectural statement or question in itself. And so some of my signs or abstract values that I want to question and achieve is like the line as the main medium or code of discussing, of representing, and demarcating architectural space, but not necessarily understood as a boundary, so as a division line between inside or outside, or nothingness and matter, but the line as architecture itself, when it becomes a field, a convoluted splitter field, where the line itself does not represent architecture, but becomes the medium in the matter of architectural speculation itself. This leads into inquiries into 2.5 dimensionalities, again, where speculation of two-dimensional drawings, so these are purely vectorial, so the line, draw, not Photoshop images, 2D drawings that through their construction are actually representing three-dimensional space, which is not there, but is perceived by it. Again, this is this feedback loop that I'm quite interested in. Again, this is a couple of years old, but it was my attempt to speculate about what was next or what's next beyond the blob. So something like 8 or 9 years ago, where the surface architecture, the creation of complete entities, what was mostly discussed, I started visualizing and experimenting and thinking about jungle system, which means like not the definition of one singular element, but about a multitude of per se unexact elements that engage in the articulation of complexity, depth, and convolution. As you can see here, this was a zoom in into one of these drawings. The line drawing, which means there's the endless possibilities of creating spaces just on three-dimensionality. Again, speculation on an abstract level that are quite helpful then in the rather more precise articulation of architectural drawings. Here again, where digital, something like 12 years ago, early version of a 2D program was used through the mistake of the line to generate properties like vegetation, softness, furriness, and so on and so forth. As an educator, I'm just going to show now some projects or drawings from my Westminster students where it's somehow the attempt to create speculation, drawn speculation, from a viewpoint as an architect that needs to embrace in contemporariness and sophistication within an environment that is not necessarily virtual. So these projects, done mostly for the Middle East, play very much with the abstraction and the absence of ornament of a way to speculate abstract spaces, very much from the inside out to generate visions of architecture that are, as I said, contemporary and yet centered on the cultural environment which they are supposed to respond to. This inside-outside approach is very important. I think it's part of this rendering speculation, that one is capable of using digital techniques or digital media, not necessarily to represent objects, but to construct spaces and to construct atmospheric setups that one can experience through the drawing itself. And this, again, is this feedback loop that basically the generation is not necessarily triggered at illustrating the object, but at recreating or constructing a priori a space that can be celebrated and then changed through this feedback of cognition and environmental interaction. Environment now not necessarily as sort of sustainability, but as atmospherics and cognition. And since it's about, or the speculations are necessarily not triggered at the ultimate representation of a product that needs to be sold for a competition, but it's an intermediate stage. It's an image that, again, needs to be evaluated by the designer itself to understand whether it fulfills the goals of the initial understanding. One needs to set up and establish a set of codes and scripts that are necessary to allow this translation from abstract vision into more clear understanding. And again, those scripts or this aspect of virtuality, again, is something that allows a real engagement by the user with the process itself. I'm going to show this. I hardly show this because in other setups they don't really work as images of projects. But to me they're quite important because, again, it talks very much about how the image can, on a secondary meta layer, give me feedback about its content that wasn't really a necessity at the initiation of the project. A rather, let's say, a rococo topological formation that to me then establishes and gives me feedback about invisible inhabitants, which means that through Gestalt psychology and all sort of psychological and vision optics interferences, you can see that animals or faces or people start emerging out of that abstraction. Again, to me, it's something about which is not really about architecture, but it's about the presence of a projected user or inhabitant into every kind of drawing. It doesn't necessarily need to be a drawing, a strategic diagram to explain participation or inhabitation. It can also be an image that explains interaction between a user and its environment. See other drawings through, for instance, through symmetry of abstract images. Again, animals or faces or partnership, so projective empathy emerges, and other examples as well. Some of these, I'm now trying to figure out what 3.5 dimensionality means to me, which is again a response to this aspect that actually digital architecture is misunderstood as something that is in motion and it's frozen and it's built and represent or it's attempting to convey aspects of dynamism and animation. So for me, 3.5 dimensionality, as much as the image is stuck between, or digital image is stuck, but that's the advantage between a drawing and a model, 3.5 dimensionality is stuck between a object and a space to be discovered, and which is in motion, one, through the participation of the user, two, through the variability of the environment. So this is work in progress, so I can't comment too much on it, but it's, again, it's work in progress in a sense that it's the images that, for me, project and articulate the questions that then need to be asked more rigorously through theoretical inquiry and propositional design protocols. An important concept that transpires through the work is the one of the poetic image. It is a word which is described by the Italian architect Carlo Molino as that image that is capable of overlapping intuition and expression, which means it's where the image actually is capable of fulfilling my understanding of what I want to communicate from my architectural vision, which is somewhere in my brain or in my heart or wherever it is. But it's also capable of expressing those qualities to someone else. And it's there that actually also, in my opinion, the dichotomy between the image and the diagram, as expressed by Bachelard in his work, where he said there's a very clear division between the feminine understanding of image and the masculine understanding of diagram, and there's no way of actually interlinking the two. Some might say that the two schools are divided by this understanding, the one down the road and this one. I think that's absolutely not true. It's the inquiry, and it's actually, to me, exactly that particular work that lies in between representation and between abstract, pure strategic understanding of space, that it's the most particularly interesting one. So these images, again, are not necessarily projects, but expressions of qualities, of properties that I want to achieve. Some of that work that, again, it's got very much to do with ornamentation, the definition of properties, of spatial characteristics that are established not necessarily through technology, but through phenomenological understanding of architecture, happens very much in the work of Unit 20 at the Bartlett, where a design protocol, this is work by Tobias, by the way, where the design protocol is not only triggered at fabrication, not only triggered at the manufacturing of those ideas, but it's very much about the establishment and the widening of the architectural vocabulary. In order to do that, we look very much back at I don't want to use the word taboo because it's far too strict, but at a debate, at a concept that are often misregarded, such as style, aesthetic, personal interpretation, intuition, the aspect of the figural, the body, the understanding of technology as being merely a medium for expression rather than the final means of design protocols, of textures, of spatial properties, and the very end about the celebration of space rather than the optimization of structures and engineered understanding of architecture. Yes, of course, one can use all sorts of digital techniques and media to fulfill those aims, whether it's 3D, 2D, or 4D dimensional techniques, but it's always triggered towards the expression of an intuitive and personal understanding of space. So whatever it is, it's kind of this aspect of design or descripting, which means description of understanding, a definition, a rendering of an idea. It's always also not necessarily to do with actuality, with the representation of a default condition right now, but to me it's always to do about speculation into the future. So another very interesting quote by Briggs, where it says, like, we've seen design, so the Latin-Italian etymology of the word brings you back to sign, abstraction, whereas Entwurf or project, the same, it's about looking into the future. You throw an idea into the future and see what happens. So speculation, for me, is a priori not a statement, but a question about what if, or what could happen if that happens. So design or rendering speculation about premonition, prediction, presumption, speculation, and vision, and hence approximation, rather than a dictatorial, methodological, and doctrinaire definition of what is right and what is wrong. I've got absolutely no patience for those academic curricula that prescribe techniques or modus operandi for students. I think they are more helpful in narrowing down the conversation about architecture rather than opening up the debate. So also the idea exuberance, which I suppose you can buy down in the shop, it's my latest attempt to give voice to very prominent people in the field of digital architecture that all somehow argue for the invisibility of techniques. So it's actually about expression, it's about style. I've also, as a fulfilled researcher, say, I've got a doctorate, and since then I feel quite comfortable in being superficially rigorous. I think that everything that deals with the too direct expression of techniques or tools or skills To me, it's not really a proper way to see what architecture can be beyond the limits and the affordances of the medium. So it's always to do with this prediction of something that's beyond the common sense, the default, and the thing that we know right now. And if you want to spare with me another 2-3 minutes, I'm going to show some of the work again by me and by my practice, which I run with Marcus Cruz, which is also my teaching partner. They ordered from small scale to large scale, and again, it's nothing else but a series of, it's not paintings, it's not diagram, it's not mere images, but it's a setup of a set of self-references that it's more than a catalog of ideas, it's less than a curriculum, or it's less than a portfolio of projects. We are in the moment right now to try to translate some of the research, the ideas that have been generated in conversation with ourselves, intimately with us as individual researchers, with the students, into a scale that goes beyond these installations, which we've done plenty of, into a build scale where some of these environmental, structural, stylistic, spatial, and ornamental features can be integrated into a process that it's still intelligent and responsive to the users of the client. So aspects of materiality, of some of the qualities that, for instance, the images at the beginning of blurriness, of a certain materiality that is particular to computer screens, that is capable of being translated into an architecture, not necessarily through structural optimization again, but through the pursuit of phenomena. In order to do that, light plays an enormous role, as much as materiality, and the environment, as I repeat myself, not in terms of sustainability, but in terms of atmospherics. How do we understand and express and also interact with a space? Compared to some of these images date back 10 or 12 years, and you might notice that compared to rather more also published understanding of or depiction and also propagandistic definition of digital architecture, the use of color is important to us, the use of materiality, the invisibility of techniques, the not the optimization of tessellated system, but actually the language of the drawings suppose the prediction of spaces without it being necessarily hyperrealistic. So a hyperrealistic, I suppose that a hyperrealistic rendering cannot be a speculation because it's actually a representation of a non-real understanding of reality that actually it becomes a hyperfake, but that's another conversation. But it's actually somehow the personal interpretation of that reality in that context that we try to convey through our drawings as well. I mentioned before that some of this work is a cooperation between two people, hence the language of the drawings is also the orchestration and the mitigation of two people having individual stories, narratives, aims, and goals of that particular drawing. But it's the language, it's the speculation then that becomes, again, to repeat myself, that poetic image which is capable of fulfilling our desires to pleasure ourselves, but also to communicate values and criteria of program space, materiality, and so on and so forth to the client and to other people. So I think that's it. As I said, as a speculation, or since today's afternoon is about speculation, I found it quite uncomfortable actually to give a speech about things, but I would have liked to ask more questions, and I hope that the debate at the end actually more than about a series of manifestos becomes really a general conversation about whether speculation is actually an interesting thing to do. Thank you very much. It's about speculation. I found it quite uncomfortable actually to give a speech about things, but I would have liked to ask more questions, and I hope that the debate at the end actually more than about a series of manifestos becomes really a general conversation about whether speculation is actually an interesting thing to do. Thank you very much.
Hi. So my name is Z.Fogel, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about visual effects today. And so I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about myself before I start going into details. I grew up in California in the United States, and I did various jobs when I was growing up, including actually some architectural drawing and web design and that sort of work. And I went to university down in Southern California, at the University of Southern California, where I got a couple of degrees, one in computer science and one in film production. So I think I knew from a very early stage that I wanted to be doing kind of visual effects and animation and working kind of in the both with one foot into the artistic realm and the creative realm and one foot into the very technical realm. After I finished up university, I did a brief stint at Industrial Light and Magic, which is George Lucas's company that did Star Wars and those types of films. But pretty soon after that, I found myself at Pixar Animation Studios. And that's where I spent the brunt of my career. I spent about 8 years there and worked on most of the films there, including Finding Nemo, the short film Bounding, The Incredibles, and then Cars, Ratatouille, and then finally WALL-E. And that was the last film I worked on at Pixar before moving over here to London. And here I'm working at a visual effects house just down in Soho called Double Negative. And the first film that I worked on was Angels and Demons. And I came over here to do crowds and some big scenes that they had to do for Angels and Demons. And I'm now working on a film called John Carter of Mars, which is due out soon, but I'll talk a little bit about it later. So that's kind of my background. And I just want to tell you a little bit about Double Negative. So we're obviously here in Soho. We only do visual effects for films. We don't do any commercials or other types of work like that. We don't do any animation for fully 3D animated films like Pixar. And the company was formed back in 1998. There were about 30 people then, and it's grown quite a bit over the course of the last 10 or 12 years. There's about 750 people there now. About 400 of those people do what I do, which is the 3D aspects, and about 200 of them do 2D, so compositing and that sort of job. And we have a production staff helping with management and producing and coordinating of about 44 people. And then we have a small team doing research and development, and that's about 30 people or so. So I'm just going to scroll through some of the films that we've worked on at Double Negative. You might you might recognize some of them, you might not, but since 1998, you can see that the number of films that Double Negative have worked on has gone up quite a bit. We've worked on a large number of films, and it's pretty interesting to look back through kind of to see what types of things they've done. A lot of the work that we've done at Double Negative has been environmental. We're very well known for our extensions of environments, cities, that sort of work. And we're only now just starting to get into more kind of creature and character work, in addition to kind of the effects and environmental work that we've done. So these are some of the films that we're currently working on. Like I said before, I'm currently working on John Carter of Mars, and this is a big sci-fi movie that's going to be coming out in 2012, and it's an adaptation of an Edgar Rice Burroughs novel that was written in around 1912, and it's about a Civil War general who somehow magically, miraculously finds himself on Mars and kind of the shenanigans that ensue. So I want to show the reel that Double Negative has to show you kind of some of the types of work that we've done. You probably will recognize some of the films, some of them you might not. This is kind of an older reel. We obviously can't show some of the work that we're working on currently, so I'll just go ahead and run that now. So you can see that a lot of the work that we've done has been environmental, amongst other things like the effects and explosions and stuff like that. So there are actually quite a few similarities between architecture and visual effects, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end. But I wanted to kind of go through the visual effects pipeline with you guys and explain a little bit about how we do the type of work that we do. You'll see that there are probably a lot of similarities and a lot of differences in the way that we work. So I'm going to go through a typical visual effects pipeline. This is kind of the way that we run most of the films that we do at Double Negative. And I'm going to give you a little preview of what it looks like. Don't worry, I'm going to go through this a little bit in detail. I just wanted to give you all an idea of kind of where we're headed for this type of thing. This is a pretty typical pipeline for visual effects. The pipelines kind of change from show to show, and based on the needs of what a particular film needs, based on the clients and how much experience they have working on visual effects, and also based on the crew. You know, if you have a crew that can do certain types of things and not other types of things, a lot of times this pipeline will change. It's a very malleable pipeline, and oftentimes we're changing these pipelines midstream through a production. So if we need to deal with something particular that's going on a show, we can kind of mix things up as we're going. So I'm going to go through this pipeline. It's kind of a generalized pipeline, and it is pretty much the same type of pipeline that we'll see in most visual effects houses, certainly the bigger ones that are working on kind of the Hollywood type movies. So here we go. I'll talk a little bit about each stage here. So there's 3 main stages. This first stage is pre-production, and this is where we do a lot of the planning and development that we do for the film. So it includes a lot of artwork, a lot of design and concepts. This is where we get a lot of inspiration for how the final frames of the images for the film should look. So we do a bunch of this concept work for the sets, for the characters, kind of for all the aspects of the film as we're going through here. And this is a place where we work very closely with the clients, with the director of the film, with the art directors of the film, to try and figure out kind of what they're looking for. The next stage is production, and this is where we actually begin shooting the film. So the visual effects soup and some key visual effects people will generally go out onto set for parts of the shoot, and basically what they're doing is making sure that the elements that are being shot are going to work in the post-production process. Also during that time, while they're out on set, the visual effects studio is going to be continuing with pre-production and continuing with starting to create assets for the film. So this is where we're doing a lot of the building of the assets. And while we're also on set, there's a lot of stuff that we as a visual effects post house are trying to collect and trying to capture from on set. So other than the actual footage that we're actually going to use as plates for our film, we end up taking a lot of pictures of the set, of the actors, and trying to get as much detailed information as we can there. So post-production, which is the next stage and the final stage, this is also the biggest stage for a visual effects house. This is where the brunt of the work is done. So I'll go ahead and start going through some of the specifics that take place in these three main stages. I'm going to go through all the aspects of the actual pipeline, but I wanted to highlight for you some of these areas that are more relevant to architecture, I think. If people want to know more about a particular section or something like that, feel free to ask in the Q&A section, and I can go over things in more detail. But these are kind of some of the things that I think are very similar between architecture and visualization and between the way that we do things in visual effects. So during the pre-production phase, we start our research and development effort. This is where we're developing any tools that we're going to need on the film. And we also try and set up and develop a pipeline that we're going to use on the film. And it's this is a really useful part of the production process, as it is in any process. We're trying to set everything up so that when we actually do start working on shots, it's smooth running. So then we do some tests after we've kind of started developing our pipeline. These tests, we'll do them for a variety of different reasons. A lot of times we'll do some tests to see if we can achieve some particular technical challenge, to see, oh, we've got this underwater crazy sequence with explosions, can we do that? A lot of times we'll do tests for our client as a proof of concept so that they can gain confidence that the vision that they have for the film is something that we can portray. So different projects have differing needs for the types of tests that we're going to do, but this is also a really great opportunity for us to test our pipeline and to test the research and development that's been going on. And we can take something to pretty near completion in this test phase, and this way we can tell where we need to focus our R&D efforts and also hopefully find out what artistic elements we're going to need to focus on the most to get the best elements out of the film. And this is also where a lot of the where we get to know how the director and how the clients and the art directors and those kinds of people work, and you start developing a relationship with the key people in the creative realms to make sure that you're communicating on the same kind of level and you're understanding each other and you have the same terminology for these types of things. So the next phase is modeling. And as you can see, this task runs over all three phases of production. And it starts very early in this pre-production phase, but we continue refining and adding more models all throughout the production and even into the early phases of post-production. So there's artists who specialize almost entirely in modeling. And some of the better modelers actually come from an architectural background. Some of them also come from a fine arts background and have sculpting skills and that sort of thing, but certainly for environments and set work, a lot of the people who are very successful in modeling come from architecture. And can I turn off the video for this next one? Here's an example of an architectural model. This is an architectural model that we created for Angels and Demons. Usually when we create a model for a main set or a main creature, it goes through a series of reviews and revisions. And so we often look at a model like this from lots of different angles, and we try to look at it in all the possible ways that we might be able to see it in the film. So even after we approve a model like this, there's almost always minor tweaks that go on, so there's a lot of back and forth. When we're showing it to the director kind of out of context, like something like this, it might be difficult for them to get a sense of it without actually seeing it in a shot. So we're always going back and forth. And in terms of the actual software that we use and that sort of thing, it's very similar, and we do use a bunch of off-the-shelf software like Maya, ZBrush, SciSlice, those kinds of things. So there's really a lot of similarities here with architecture. You can turn the video back on. So I'll talk a little bit now about previs. So during this pre-production phase, we start doing some pre-visualization. And this is where we take some of the models that we've already created, or we take some temp versions of assets that we've created, and we try to get a working version of a 3D representation of all the shots that we're planning to do. And we do this so that we can actually make sure that we know what we're doing. It's a cheap way of planning this all in advance. Before you actually go out and you start shooting everything, and you start expending a bunch of money with all the actors on these crazy big sets and spending all that money, what you really want to do is have some pre-visualization. So there's a lot of time and energy spent here to try and make sure that you get it as accurate as you can and as much to the director's vision as you can before they actually go out onto set, onto the production. So during the production phase, this is where we actually go out and start shooting things. So we collect tons and tons of reference photos. So here's some examples of some reference photos that were taken on set. And we often get a bunch of reference when we're actually on set. Sometimes we'll get reference sent to us by the client, images that they might have found on the internet that they're interested in something looking like, or anything can be referenced. So basically, if it's something that will help our digital artists to get to the finished version faster and they have more of a goal to work towards, then we'll use it. So these are some examples of reference that we used for Angels and Demons for St. Peter's Square. Also, during production, we get more data from our sets. So we try to get as much data as we can when we're on set. And one of the things that we get is LiDAR. And what LiDAR is it stands for light detection and ranging. Some of you may have heard of it before, but it's an optical remote sensing technology, and it measures the scattered light to find the range of distant objects. So we use this data to create 3D models of the actual real-world set. So objects, terrains, anything where we're shooting, we actually try to get as accurate of a representation of it as possible. So basically, this is just a method that uses laser pulses to find the distance to a bunch of objects. So the range is determined by measuring the time delay from when the transmission of the pulse and the detection of the reflected signal comes. We use LiDAR on almost every film these days. It's a starting point for our models and for our environments, and it's a starting point for us to get some realistic sets and to try to match things so that we are able to match our background plates that we're actually shooting with the 3D elements that we're creating. So also during production, we get a bunch of high-res images while we're on set. So we call these HDRI, or high dynamic range images. And we capture as much as we can on set, and we use these for a variety of different reasons. Here's an example of a standard HDR image. This can be used as an environmental map in lighting. So this is an example from St. Peter's Square in Italy. But basically, we're able to capture these images that they have a much more dynamic range than standard digital imaging techniques, and that way we can really tell differences in luminances between really, really bright sunlight and even to the dimmest starlight. That's the type of dynamic range that these images will give us. So here's some other examples of some HDR images. A lot of times what we'll do is we'll take these images on set and then use them back at the studio to stitch together and start using them with our in-house software and use these as a basis for our textures, for our texture artists to start painting with, to create the actual textures that will then be mapped back onto the geometry to create our assets. So back to the pipeline here. Also during this production phase, this is where we're going to start getting actual scans of film footage that were shot on set. Sometimes these are shot on a green screen, sometimes they're not, and this is the basis for what we're going to be working with to actually make the final image. And then we go into the post-production phase, and this is, like I said, the brunt of where we do most of our work in visual effects. So we've gathered all the stuff that we're going to gather from the set, and now we have those film scans. We're going to do some grading, and this is basically where we manipulate the source material so that it has the correct grade and it has consistent grain and color and that sort of thing. And then also in the 2D world, we do some plate preparation. So it's basically preparing the plate for actual use. So that includes a lot of things. It can be, you know, removing green screens, doing some dust busting, doing some spot removal, just making the images pretty at that point. One of the first phases in visual effects that happens after this stuff has started being created, all the assets are being created, is rigging. And this is basically creating a skeleton for models that need to move. So it's basically digital puppetry. And it's adding controls to a model so that we can move it realistically and animate it later. While the rigging is going on, we're also starting to grab the film scans and create 3D environments to match all the plates that we've received. So this process is called match moving. This is an example of a match move. It's a technique that allows us to place computer graphics, CG footage, into live action footage with the correct position, the correct scale, all the orientations are lined up, and we make sure that the motion of where we have it in the actual CG universe is relative to the photographed objects in a scene. So we just basically need to make sure that everything lines up so that when we start adding 3D into it, it matches with the plates that we received. So once we have our characters rigged and our scenes set up with cameras, we can start animating. We can actually start adding things into our scenes. And so animation is a complete talk in and of itself. I could go on for hours and hours just about animation. There's entire books written on the subject, but for today, let's just say that animation is a key part of how you experience a visual effects film. Closely related to animation is effects. So effects animation doesn't involve animating characters, but it does animating everything else you see moving on screen. So for example, fire, dust, explosions, crumbling buildings, basically anything that moves and isn't a character, that's what we consider visual effects. And this is actually kind of the bread and butter of the visual effects industry, as the name would imply. This is the first thing that we did that we used computers for to generate things for films. You know, the first step in this process of creating entirely CG films was actually doing these types of effects. So while the animation is going on, there's a separate track that's working on the look of all the assets. Texturing and shading is where we create the look of a certain object. So texture artists use the photos that we've captured on set, and they also do some hand painting and hand drawing to create textures for all the characters and all the sets that you see in 3D in these films. So there's two parts to the process of texturing and shading. The shading part involves actually writing a shader that describes how the surfaces of a given model are going to react to light. So what color is the object? How reflective is the object? How does the object respond to diffuse light, to specular light, to reflective light? How bumpy is it, or how smooth is it? How much opacity does it have? Is it transparent? Is it really opaque? How much light can seep through the object? Does it have some idea of subsurface scattering, which is what human skin has? How much does it respond to backlighting? And all these kinds of things. These are things that are described by the shader. And so, in order to assist the shader in actually having the object look its best, the shader usually accepts a series of what we call texture maps. And these can be painted by hand, or they can be taken from photographic data, or any combination of that. And so, for instance, there might be a texture map that's painted to describe the colors. So all those pictures that we saw of the St. Peter's Square, those would actually be used as color maps for a lot of the facades of the basilica. So it's not uncommon for us to have texture maps for all kinds of things. We sometimes have texture maps for the breakup of a specular object, and for displacement, to see how bumpy or smooth things are in certain areas. All these kinds of different masks, this is usually stuff that a texture artist will create. And like I said, sometimes by hand and sometimes from photographs. So hand in hand with texturing and shading is the look development. And this is where we take all the models with shaders, with textures, and we take all the environments and we create lighting setups that are going to further define how the objects actually respond to lighting. So during the look dev phase, there's a lot of back and forth with shading and texture artists to make sure that we have the best possible information going into the shaders. We usually do this look development in a variety of different lighting setups. So we'll try to do them in a normal kind of white light setup so that we know what it will look like as a standard. But then we also try to do as many lighting setups as we think we're going to see this object in the actual film. So if we see the objects in night light, we'll try to do a setup like that. If we see the objects in a strong daylight, we'll try to do it like that. Once we've look dev'd all these assets, then we go ahead and light. So the lighting and rendering phase is where we pull all of the 3D elements together, and we pull in all the environments, all the characters, everything, and make sure that everything looks good. And we also try to match to the background plate that we have as much as possible. So lighting in 3D, it's a lot like lighting in live action or lighting for photography or lighting for anything in the real world. All the same principles apply. You want the sets and the characters to look appealing and have shape and definition from the lighting. In visual effects, you have a plate that is supposed to inform your lighting decisions. So if there's live action characters in the scene, real humans, you try to match the lighting response so that when you add everything together into the plate, it actually looks like it all fits. So once you have all of these 3D assets lit, you can submit all of that, and the last stage comes up. But we've got everything else. We're almost ready to do our final composite, but we still might need to do a little bit of work to get some extra stuff if we don't have it. So this is where we do things like rotoscoping. This is basically taking the film scans and getting everything out of them that you don't want, and then you can have a cleaner plate. So this is a process that in and of itself is kind of a bit complicated, and there's lots of off-the-shelf packages that deal with this kind of thing, so I won't go into it in much detail. Now we have clean plates and beautiful 3D elements, but we still might need a little bit more to pull this whole thing together. So this is where we might actually need to do some extra element shoots. If there's extra elements that we need in a shot to make it perfect, but it's really going to be quite difficult or quite expensive to build those things in 3D, or it's just easier to actually go out and shoot some elements, then we might actually do that so that we can combine that element back into the final image. So now we have everything. We take all these elements and we feed them into compositing. And this is where the final image is created. And it takes everything that's been created so far, and it makes everything all fit together and look amazing. So here's an example of some compositing being done in Shake. And Shake is an off-the-shelf package that a lot of the industry uses. Recently, the industry in general has been moving more towards using a different compositing software package called Nuke. So, but basically, compositing is the same no matter what type of software or what tools you're using. The idea is that you want all of the visual elements and that are all coming from separate sources, from things that were shot on set, things that were shot on a green screen, all the 3D elements that were created. You want them all to blend together into one final 2D image to create the illusion that all those elements actually came from the same place. So that's it. Everything gets output to the client at that point, and the process continues, and there's fixes, and there's always kind of a constant dialogue going on, and it just continues and continues. So that's a pretty good idea of how the pipeline generally flows through most visual effects houses. So I want to go a little bit into detail about some of the stuff that we did for Angels and Demons. And this is specifically kind of about environment work and how it relates to architecture. So if we could turn off the video from this point forward, that would be great. So for Angels and Demons, we had to build and light the environments for all of the external shots of St. Peter's Square. And we faced a bunch of challenges while we were doing it. We had to construct the whole exterior, and one of the big problems was that the Vatican didn't allow the filmmakers to shoot on location in Vatican City. There were some obvious reasons that they might not have wanted us to be there, so a lot of the procedures that we normally used in recreating a set or doing set extensions, we actually couldn't use in this case for this film. So it ended up creating some problems that we're not actually used to solving, so it was kind of a bit of a challenge in that way. In the end, we ended up building 2 different versions of St. Peter's Square. And basically, we had 4 weeks of principal photography that went on in Rome, but avoiding Vatican City as they weren't going to let us in there. So one of the things that we didn't get is great LiDAR data. So like I talked about before, this is really the basis of how we start building our environments and building our sets so that we can match the plates correctly. And because we weren't allowed in the Vatican, we couldn't actually get any of those architectural survey tools. So since we weren't allowed to do our normal data and photographic acquisition, we sent actually a small team into Italy, posing as tourists, to photograph as many high-res stills of the Vatican structures as we could. And we ended up with about 250,000 high-res images that we took in our time there as tourists. And we used those in conjunction with kind of some of our 3D in-house tools to do some image reconstruction. So we have this tool. This is a photogrammetry tool. And what we do is we pick points on the photographs, and our software works out where those points are in relationship to each other in 3D space and physical space. Normally what we'd do is we'd take those points and then we'd fit those, we'd fit all the photographed data that we have here onto the LiDAR data of an environmental geometry. But since we didn't have LiDAR data in this case, we had to use this photography to generate these 3D points in space. And then we took those 3D points in space and gave them to a modeler. And the modeler's job was to actually try to make some sense of those points and create a model that was as accurate as we could, given the fact that we had some really good reference from digital stills, and that we kind of, there's some common sense used in terms of just trying to get the things to line up. So then what we did was we took those models that were then created by a modeler, and we fit the photographs back onto the models. So it was a little bit of a backwards scenario for us. We also did a helicopter shoot over Rome to capture a bunch of the daylight aerial textures that we used for the film and for the Vatican, and we used some high-res satellite imagery and that sort of thing. Basically anywhere we could get data from without actually going there. So we ended up actually trying to build 100% scale of the whole area. We wanted to build all these pieces of the set to scale, but we encountered a bunch of problems along the way. The first one we encountered was it was really hard for us to achieve a strong lineup because our model was assuming that St. Peter's was built on a perfectly flat plane, but in reality, it's pretty uneven, and there's quite a slope from the basilica, sloping down away from the basilica, so there was definitely some issues with our lineup trying to get things set up right. Obviously, since we couldn't shoot at the Vatican, we weren't going to really bring Tom Hanks and the full crew in there to shoot, so they ended up building a scaled version of part of the basilica in Hollywood Park in Los Angeles. The idea was that we could then do digital set extensions as they were needed based on this. So we would use these background plates, and then we would just add extensions where we needed them onto this scaled set. Unfortunately, the scale that they used to build the set in LA wasn't exactly consistent. So it quickly became really clear that we weren't really going to be able to simply just scale our 100% full scale model down to match the set version that they created. So we ended up having to rebuild a second version. So we built the second version so that we could make it match the set that they'd built in LA. So you can see here, the top here is the actual scale of St. Peter's Square. And this is the one that we built to spec. And the bottom one is the one that we built to match the Los Angeles set that they'd created. You can see that the scale is kind of off. It looks quite a bit different. The original plan was to do, like I said, a set extension of all those shots that they shot in Hollywood. But unfortunately, it was pretty obvious that because of the inaccurate proportions that they had in the set that they built, it destroyed really any sense that you had of the huge scale of the real square. It was pretty obvious that the obelisk is much, much larger. The colonnades are bigger. It feels like a toy set. So there were some really obvious differences, and it made it really hard to achieve any continuity between shots as well. So we made the decision pretty early on that we were going to remove the set that they'd shot completely from all of the shots that we received it in and replace it with a version of the 100% build that we'd done, which meant a lot more work for our rotoscope artists who had to hand paint out the set that they had done in LA for all the shots, which meant if they just shot it on a green screen in the first place, it would have been much easier. But that was another problem that we ran into. We had to work because of that, because we thought that we were going to never be seeing this thing really up close, because we were always going to be seeing the scaled set that they'd built in LA, we had to work quite a lot harder to make our 100% build hold up. So the basilica is obviously a complicated facade, and due to the sheer complexity of it, and at least we had good photographic reference, but we didn't have a lot of that LiDAR data, like I said, and so our models were never going to be 100% correct, but nevertheless, it was difficult because we ended up, the modeling and the texture teams both had some difficulty realizing just how close we were going to be getting to this element and the angles that we were going to see this thing from. So we started out at the beginning with 9 basic textures for the basilica, and then that expanded quickly to 21, and that expanded into larger maps, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger as we decided that we were going to need more detail. Another place where we decided that we were going to need more detail, you can see the top row, those were the statues on the top of the basilica. That was kind of the level of detail that we had modeled those to. And because we didn't think we were going to ever really get that close, but it became really obvious that we were going to be getting that close, and so we actually had to model some hero statues. And what we would do is when we got very close to a statue, we would swap it out with one of these higher resolution modeled statues as the shot dictated. So we did the same thing for a lot of cases. So we had multiple levels of details for different parts of the building. So here's an example of both the low-res and the high-res colonnades that we had to use. So if we were far, far away, we could use something on the left, and as we got really close, we had to use something more like on the right. Same thing because of if we were ever going to be doing stuff like we flew over the roof of the basilica, which we never would have thought we would have had to see this close. So we had to do a lot of times where we'd have to add extra modeling definition into the facade. Like this place, we had to add more into the roof so that we had more detail, because otherwise it just wasn't holding up. Another thing that happened is because we didn't actually have that full coverage of the environment, a lot of times it was just actually impossible for us to get the geometry just right. So what we had to do is have our texture artists and our painters make up for that. So originally we didn't think we'd get very close or to this angle from the basilica, but when we did, we realized that our geometry still didn't hold up. So for these kinds of shots, what we did was we rendered out an image of the basilica with the environments that we had, and what you see is that top image, where you can see there's some weird holes and doesn't exactly look like it's the right kind of scale. And then what we would do is take those still images and have a matte painter paint how it should look, and then project those images back onto the building as a card, so that we had kind of the right looking thing. So the bottom is a fixed image, as you can see. So pretty much every shot that we did for this film was rendered in 3D. There was a CG basilica. All the neighboring buildings were CG. And then further back, some of the background buildings relied on matte painting, textures, and we would then reproject some of those matte paintings back onto building geometry. But pretty much the entirety of everything you saw in the basilica in this film was actually CG. None of it was really shot there. So it was actually a pretty big challenge. One of the other challenges that we had was lighting. So actually trying to light this set created some pretty major problems. After we added everything in, we had about 650 lights in this scene to try to create this type of lighting in a nighttime scene. So here's an example showing some of the basic elements of our nighttime lighting setup. We used a bunch of reflections, a bunch of you can see there's a reflection all over the cobblestones, and there's all these windows in the facade. So it was actually, the challenge usually in visual effects is day, because you see everything in daylight. It's very bright. You see details and things. But ironically, for this film, the challenge was actually lighting it in the nighttime setups. You'd think that the darkness would help, but in this case, because of all the reflections and all the specular highlights and all the complexity of the facade, particularly all the cobblestones, it was actually more complex for us to do at night. Also, the director, Ron Howard, he decided that having intermittent lights between all the statues wasn't actually dramatic enough. So as you can see at the top, that's actually St. Peter's Square at night. There's, a few spotlights, but that wasn't enough. We had to add more and more so we could get that sense of sparkly and glistening and Hollywoody kind of stuff. So let's face it, our job in visual effects isn't to reproduce reality. It's to deliver pretty pictures, and it's to make the audience experience something, it's to make sure that the director is happy with the actual final images. So sometimes that means we rake lights across surfaces from completely unjustified sources, or we completely break the rules of physics. We do this all the time, and we do it judiciously. And that's actually something that we do through every step of our process. And that's something that's different, I think, between architecture and animation. Because we're always cheating. We're always cheating. So breaking the rules of physics is something that looks good. It can look very good in a 2D space. So because what we're actually creating at the end of the day is a 2D image, there are some things we can do that if you were to look at them in 3D would not look right and would look really, really crap. So we do a bunch of these kinds of cheats in visual effects, but despite that kind of difference, there's actually a lot of similarities between architecture and visual effects and animation. For one thing, the type of person who is adept and able to do the type of work that we do in visual effects is very similar to the type of person that is successful for architecture. And I think that has to do with the style of learning that we go through. We kind of go through the same process of learning and try to discover and solve problems in a very similar way. So I think that's very similar. Also, in both of our industries, there's really there's a mixture between being very creative and artistic and between being very technical and attention to detail and that sort of thing. So I think that's something else that's really very common. A lot of visual effects artists, especially people who do environment work and modeling work, come from architectural backgrounds, and some of the best visual effects artists actually come from architecture. So there's definitely a lot of crossover, and so I think it's a useful thing to know about and to know that it exists and it's out there if you were interested. So that's it. That's all for now, and then we can talk later when we do our discussion.